Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the curtains of the Parker residence in Ashland, Oregon, when Helen Parker returned from a week-long teacher training seminar in Portland. She carried her worn leather tote in one hand, humming absently, already picturing the quiet of her bedroom, the lavender sheets she'd washed before leaving, the scent of cedar from the dresser her late husband built years ago. But as she stepped into the hallway and turned the brass doorknob of her room, the image shattered. A woman lay comfortably across her bed, Agnes Moore, her daughter-in-law's mother. Pillows were rearranged, drawers half open, perfume bottles scattered across the vanity. Agnes's robe hung from the wardrobe door. Her slippers rested neatly by the nightstand, right where Helen's used to be. Helen froze, unable to process what she was seeing. "Mrs. Moore," she finally whispered, though the woman was fast asleep, snoring softly, utterly at ease. The next sound she heard was the click of a closing door. Daniel Parker, her only son, stepped into the hallway. He looked tired, impatient, older than his 28 years, and when his eyes met hers, there was no warmth. "Daniel," Helen said quietly, "what's going on? Why is Agnes in my room?" He exhaled sharply, as if the question itself annoyed him. "She's been staying here since you left. Mom, Emily's mother isn't well. She needs rest. It's just temporary." Helen's fingers tightened around the strap of her tote. "Then where am I supposed to sleep?" Daniel folded his arms. "If you don't like it, you can leave." The words landed like a blow. She stared at him, waiting for a smile, a sign that he hadn't meant it. But his expression stayed cold, detached, almost rehearsed. "Leave," she repeated. "This is my house." He shrugged. "Ours. Dad left it to the family. Emily and I live here too, and right now it's what's best. Agnes can't climb stairs easily, and she needs Emily close." Helen's voice trembled. "And your solution is to put her in my bed." "Mom," he said, rubbing his temples, "please don't make this harder. You've been difficult lately. Emily tries so hard, and you never show her any kindness. She feels judged. Maybe you don't realize how much pressure that puts on me." Helen felt the air thin around her. "I've cooked for her, helped with the baby, cleaned this house. What more kindness could she want?" Daniel's tone sharpened. "Understanding. She's taking care of her mother, and you can't even share a space for a few days without turning it into drama." Helen blinked back tears. "You're choosing her family over your own." He looked away. "I'm choosing peace." The silence stretched until even the ticking clock in the hallway felt loud. Helen glanced toward the bed again, the blankets wrinkled by someone else's sleep, her own pillow replaced with another scent, and knew there was no room left for her here. She straightened her shoulders, the quiet dignity that had carried her through Michael's death rising again. Without another word, she crossed the room, opened the closet, and pulled out her suitcase. Daniel didn't move. "Where will you go?" he asked finally, his voice low but still defensive. "I don't know," she said, "but I won't stay where I'm not wanted." Helen paused at the doorway, looking one last time at the walls she'd painted with her husband decades ago, the place that held their laughter and her son's childhood dreams. Then she stepped outside, the evening wind brushing her face as the door closed softly behind her. The house remained still, too still. Inside, nothing stirred but the faint rhythm of a woman's breathing in the bed that once belonged to her. Outside, Helen walked down the path lined with fading lavender, the gravel crunching under her shoes. She didn't look back. The silence that followed her wasn't defeat. It was the silence before the storm. The following morning, the chill of early autumn drifted through Lithia Park. Helen sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the pond, where ducks cut slow ripples through the mirrored surface. Her hands, folded in her lap, felt oddly empty, no papers to grade, no lesson plan to think about. Only the hum of the water fountain and the ache that had settled in her chest since last night. The park had always been her refuge. She'd come here with her students for picnics, with Michael for quiet evenings when they were young and broke, but full of dreams. The memory came back as vividly as the scent of pine, the day they laid the first brick of their house. Michael had been 28, sleeves rolled up, skin bronzed from the Oregon sun. "We can't afford fancy contractors," he'd said, laughing. "But I can lay bricks and you can paint. Between us, we'll make it a home." Helen could still see the dust on his face, the way his eyes glinted with stubborn joy as they worked side by side. Him laying the foundation, her sanding window frames, her hands covered in paint. On weekends, they'd sleep on the floor of the half-built house, dreaming aloud about where Daniel's room would be, how he'd play in the backyard they hadn't planted yet. Years later, when the house finally stood finished, it wasn't just wood and nails. It was every laugh, every fight, every scar of their shared life pressed into the walls. Helen blinked back tears as another memory surfaced. Daniel, 5 years old, running barefoot through the hallway, holding a paper crown from kindergarten. "I'm the king, Mommy," he had shouted. She'd lifted him into her arms, kissing his cheek. "Then promise your queen you'll never leave her kingdom." "I'll never leave you, Mom," he'd said, solemnly, like a knight taking an oath. The words echoed now in her head, heavy and cruel in their innocence. She remembered the night the world fell apart. Daniel was 17, studying for finals, when Michael collapsed in the kitchen. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. She'd held his hand until it grew cold, whispering promises she'd never have the chance to keep. For weeks afterward, Daniel refused to sleep. He stayed by her side, bringing tea, repairing things he barely knew how to fix, saying, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of you now." And he did. He mowed the lawn, helped her handle the mortgage paperwork, even surprised her with flowers from the grocery store. The two of them survived together, one carrying grief, the other trying to fill its void. Helen stared across the lake, the reflection of the clouds blurring as her eyes filled. Somewhere along the years, the gentle boy who promised to protect her had turned into a man who threw her out of her own home. She thought of his voice from the night before. "If you don't like it, you can leave." Her fingers trembled as she brushed away a tear, ashamed not of crying, but of hoping he might call, might apologize, might still see her as the mother who built his world. But no call came. The pond rippled under a passing breeze, scattering her reflection into fragments. She drew her coat tighter around her shoulders, whispering to no one, "You said you'd never leave." A soft sigh escaped her lips, part sadness, part surrender. She had lost her husband to death. Now she had lost her son to life. That afternoon, Helen sat by the window of a small cafe on Main Street, the kind of place where tourists stopped for pumpkin bread and locals nursed quiet thoughts over black coffee. Outside, the clouds hung low above Ashland, pressing the light into a soft gray haze. Helen's reflection stared back at her in the glass. Tired eyes, pale lips, the faint tremor of someone who had lost too much but refused to break. She reached into her bag and took out her phone. The contact name she hadn't called in years, Robert Langford, sat near the top. Michael's oldest friend, their lawyer since before Daniel was born. For a moment, her thumb hovered over the screen, and then she pressed call. "Robert Langford," came the familiar voice, calm and steady as ever. "Robert, it's Helen." There was a pause, followed by genuine warmth. "Helen Parker. It's been ages. How are you holding up?" She hesitated, forcing her tone to stay even. "I need your help. I need an eviction notice prepared. Under Oregon law, owner-occupied property." Robert didn't answer at first. The sounds of papers, rustling, filled the line. "Eviction notice? Helen, that's serious business. Who are you evicting?" "My son," she said softly. He sighed, the kind of sigh that carried both disbelief and sympathy. "Helen, this is your son." "Yes," she replied, "and that's exactly why this hurts." For a long time neither spoke. The cafe buzzed with the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of spoons, the hiss of steaming milk. Helen stared at the tiny vase on her table. 2 daisies, half wilted, still trying to stay upright. Robert finally said, "I'll draft it. But Helen, think this through. There's no undoing it once it's delivered." "I've already been evicted from my own home," she said quietly. "All I'm doing now is making it official." When she ended the call, Helen felt an odd stillness. Not victory, not relief, just clarity. As dusk approached, she checked into an old hotel downtown, the Jefferson Inn. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and nostalgia. Her room was small, but spotless. A single bed, a desk, a window that looked out onto the streetlights below. She unpacked slowly, folding her clothes into the drawer as if arranging pieces of a past life. When everything was done, she sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped together, breathing through the quiet. Tears came, not in violent waves, but as a slow, steady release. They weren't tears of weakness. They were the kind that came when there was nothing left to lose. Outside, the rain began, soft at first, then steadier. Helen turned off the light and listened. The sound filled the room like a lullaby for the broken. Her face, reflected in the dark window, looked calm for the first time in days. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was the eye of the storm. The next morning, mist lingered over the hills as Helen's car wound through the quiet streets back toward the house she had built with her late husband. Robert Langford sat in the passenger seat, briefcase resting on his lap, his expression unreadable. Neither spoke. The hum of the engine filled the silence, steady and low, like a heartbeat that refused to break rhythm. When they reached the driveway, Helen paused before stepping out. Her hand rested on the car door handle for a long moment, her pulse calm but deliberate. "Let's do this," she said softly. Robert followed her up the porch steps, the wooden boards creaking under their feet. He straightened his tie, adjusted his glasses, and nodded toward the front door. Helen pressed the doorbell. It was Emily who opened it, hair tied back, holding a mug of coffee, her face still puffy from sleep. The moment she saw Robert beside Helen, her eyes widened. "Helen? What's going on?" "Good morning, Emily," Helen said evenly. "Is Daniel home?" Emily hesitated, glancing between them. "He's upstairs. Wait. Why is Mr. Langford here?" Before Helen could answer, Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, barefoot, his jaw tight. "What is this?" he demanded. Robert opened his briefcase, pulling out an envelope. "Mr. Parker," he began, his tone professional. "This is a formal eviction notice under Oregon law for owner-occupied property. You, your wife, and any extended guests are required to vacate within 24 hours. Emily gasped. "Eviction notice? What?" Helen's voice cut through the room, quiet but firm. "This is my house, Daniel. You told me to leave. I did. Now it's your turn." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the kitchen. Then Daniel's expression hardened. "You can't be serious. You'd really do this to your own family." Helen's face didn't change. "You already did." Emily clutched her husband's arm. "She doesn't mean it, Daniel. She's just angry. I mean every word," Helen interrupted. "I built this house with your father's hands. I've lived here through every storm, every winter. And last night, I slept in a hotel while a stranger took my bed." A faint rustle from upstairs drew their attention. Agnes Moore appeared at the top of the staircase, draped in Helen's floral robe, her hair pinned loosely. She leaned against the railing with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What's all this noise?" Helen looked up at her, no anger, only disbelief. "You're wearing my robe." Agnes shrugged, descending a few steps. "It was hanging there. Didn't think you'd mind, since you've been gone." Robert closed his briefcase with a click. "You have 24 hours to vacate, Mrs. Moore. That includes you as a non-resident guest." Emily began to cry softly, her voice breaking. "Mom, please, can we not make this worse?" Daniel turned to Helen, his tone rising. "You've lost it, Mom. You're going to regret this." Helen didn't flinch. She looked at him as if memorizing his face, as if trying to find the boy who used to promise he'd never leave her. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man she no longer recognized. She stepped back toward the doorway, her hand on the frame. "You have 24 hours, she said quietly. "Not a minute more." Then she walked out into the cold morning air. Behind her, voices erupted. Emily sobbing, Daniel shouting, but Helen didn't turn around. Her steps were slow, steady, and deliberate, each one a declaration of ownership, of dignity reclaimed. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud that echoed down the empty porch. Inside, the house she had built was no longer hers to protect. But outside, for the first time in years, she finally felt in control. By the time Helen returned to the Jefferson Inn, the clouds had begun to clear over Ashland. The small mountain town stirred awake, baristas pulling up shutters, flower shops arranging vases in the windows. Helen slipped quietly through the hotel lobby, avoiding the curious glance of the clerk. She didn't owe anyone explanations, or so she thought. Within hours, her phone began to ring. The first call was from Nancy Fields, her neighbor across the street. "Helen, dear, I just heard what happened. Is it true Daniel asked you to leave?" Helen hesitated. Something like that. Nancy clicked her tongue. Unbelievable. That boy was raised better than that. "You tell me if you need anything, all right?" Before she could respond, another call came, this time from Marjorie, a retired teacher who'd worked with her for 2 decades. "The whole faculty knows, Helen. Don't you dare stay silent. You have every right to that home." Helen tried to laugh softly, but her voice cracked. "I'm fine, Marjorie. Really." But she wasn't fine. She sat on the edge of the bed, the phone resting on her palm, watching the sunlight shift across the carpet. She had expected silence, isolation, judgment. Instead, kindness poured in from every corner of town. Around noon, there was a knock on her door. When she opened it, a group of former students stood there. 3 women now in their 30s, carrying a basket full of groceries and wildflowers. "We heard Mrs. Parker," one of them said. "You taught us to stand up for ourselves. We figured now it's our turn to stand up for you." Helen's throat tightened. She tried to thank them, but words failed. They left the basket on the table and hugged her before leaving. By evening, more people had stopped by, a colleague from the school district, the local pastor, even the manager of the grocery store where she used to shop every Friday. They brought food, blankets, and small notes tucked into envelopes. "You're not alone. We're with you. You deserve peace." The moral weight of the town tilted quietly, decisively in her favor. Everyone knew Daniel. Everyone had seen how devoted Helen had been. The story spread through whispers, not gossip, the kind that carried truth instead of malice. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Helen sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Daniel. "Mom," his voice was hoarse, trembling. "Don't do this. We're family." She closed her eyes, steadying her breath before answering. "Yesterday you told me to leave," she said softly. "Today I'm simply listening." On the other end of the line, there was only silence, a heavy, aching silence that spoke of regret too late to mend. Helen set the phone down beside her, the faint scent of wildflowers filling the room. Outside, the town hummed gently, not with noise, but with quiet solidarity. For the first time since she'd left her home, she didn't feel invisible. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The clock on the nightstand glowed past midnight when Helen's phone buzzed on the small table beside her bed. She almost ignored it, expecting another message of sympathy, another polite, "thinking of you." But the sender's name froze her hand midair. Clara Bennett, her old neighbor, the woman who lived across the street for nearly 20 years. The message was short. There's something you need to know about Emily and her mother. Helen's pulse quickened. She stared at the words until they blurred, then typed back with trembling fingers. What do you mean, Clara? The 3 little dots appeared, vanished, then appeared again. I can't explain over text. Let me come by tomorrow morning. Helen set the phone down, but sleep refused to come. The words replayed again and again. Something you need to know. She lay awake, watching the faint glow of the streetlights filter through the curtains, her mind tracing every interaction, every cold glance from Emily, every forced smile from Agnes. A dull ache formed behind her eyes. When morning finally came, a soft knock sounded at her door. Helen opened it to find Clara standing there, wrapped in a wool coat, her expression grave. She held a manila folder in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. I didn't want to believe it myself, Clara said as she stepped inside. But you need to see this. They sat by the small table near the window. Clara spread out several printed screenshots, Facebook posts, text messages, and fragments of private conversations that Helen could barely bring herself to read. The first was a Facebook post from Emily, dated 3 weeks earlier. Living with a controlling mother-in-law is exhausting. I swear, one day I'll find a way to have this house to ourselves. Helen blinked, her throat tightening. She said this publicly? Mostly private, Clara explained, but one of her friends shared it. That's how I found it. Another screenshot showed a string of iMessages between Emily and a friend named Paige. If she keeps hovering, we'll never feel like this house is ours. You need to set boundaries. Maybe she should take a long trip. She's stubborn. But Mom and I have a plan. Once she's out, she won't come back. Helen stared at the phone number visible on the screen. It was unmistakably Emily's. Her hand went cold. They planned this, she whispered. The day I found Agnes in my bed, it wasn't just inconsiderate. It was deliberate. Clara nodded solemnly. They made you believe you were unwanted. But you were their target, Helen, from the start. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of cars outside. Helen pressed a hand to her temple, trying to steady her breathing. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was strategy. Every moment of kindness from Emily, every apology, had been part of something uglier. Clara reached across the table, touching Helen's hand. I know it's hard to hear, but your son deserves to know what's really been going on. Helen looked out the window. The morning light glinted off the rooftops of Ashland, calm and indifferent. Her mind, however, felt anything but calm. She saw Daniel's face, heard his angry voice telling her to leave, and beneath the anger, she saw something else, blindness. He was manipulated, she said quietly. He trusted them. Clara's grip tightened. Then open his eyes. Helen inhaled deeply, the weight in her chest turning from sorrow to resolve. She gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and stood. My son deserves to know the truth, she said, her voice steady now, even if it destroys the picture he's living in. For the first time in days, Helen felt purpose pulse through her veins again. Not rage, not despair, but clarity. The fog that had shrouded her pain was lifting, revealing something sharper underneath, intent. She walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below, the same one she'd driven home on countless evenings before life had turned cruelly strange. They took my home, she murmured, but they won't take my dignity. Behind her, Clara smiled faintly. That's the Helen Parker I remember. By noon the following day, the air in Ashland felt heavy, as if the whole town was waiting for something to break. The 24-hour deadline had come and gone. Helen parked across the street from her house, watching the driveway filled with unfamiliar cars. Laughter floated faintly from inside. It wasn't the laughter of family, it was triumph, careless and cruel. Robert Langford stood beside her, adjusting his glasses. Are you ready? He asked quietly. Helen's eyes didn't leave the house. I was ready the moment they made me leave. They crossed the street together, the autumn wind brushing against Helen's coat. When she rang the bell, the laughter stopped. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Emily, her smile tight, rehearsed. "Helen, Mr. Langford. I wasn't expecting company." "You should have," Robert said, his voice steady. "We're here to follow up on the eviction notice." Emily's eyes darted toward the staircase, where several people had gathered, her mother Agnes, 2 cousins, and a few friends pretending not to stare. The living room looked like a scene staged for defiance. Coffee cups on the table, coats draped on chairs, as if they had settled in for the long haul. Daniel appeared from the kitchen, his jaw tense. "Mom, this is unnecessary." Helen met his gaze, but said nothing. She turned to Robert, who opened his briefcase. "Under the Oregon Owner-Occupied Property Clause," he began, "Ms. Parker is within her rights to request vacating of all non-owners. You've had 24 hours. A woman in a sharp navy suit cut him off. That won't be necessary." Her voice carried authority. "Fernanda Ruiz, attorney for the Parkers." Robert's brows lifted slightly. "Attorney?" "Yes," Emily said, crossing her arms. "We consulted Ms. Ruiz this morning. There's a signed agreement that supersedes any claim your client might make." Helen frowned. "What agreement?" Emily gestured to Fernanda, who produced a folder and laid a document neatly on the table. "This one, signed 3 years ago by Mrs. Parker herself. It grants Daniel and Emily full residential rights to the property for an indefinite period." Helen stared at the paper. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably hers, looped, precise, her handwriting down to the slant. Her pulse quickened as she read the line. "The undersigned hereby authorizes permanent occupancy of the above property by Daniel and Emily Parker, with all rights of residence." Her breath caught. "That's not possible. I never signed anything like this." Emily tilted her head. "You did, Helen. Remember? You helped me with that refinancing paperwork when we applied for the new loan. You said, 'Anything to help you two get started.'" The memory struck like a blade. The day Emily had come to her with a thick stack of papers, smiling sweetly, saying it was just routine paperwork for the bank. Helen had signed without reading, carefully, trusting as any mother would. Robert examined the document, his expression darkening. This is fraud," he muttered. "But it's legally binding until we can prove otherwise." Helen's stomach churned. "So, for now, it's her word against mine." Fernanda smiled thinly. "Not quite. It's her word, her husband's, and her mother's. I'd advise you to reconsider your approach, Mrs. Parker. Court battles are expensive." The room seemed to tilt for a moment. Helen gripped the edge of a chair to steady herself. The betrayal burned deeper than any insult Daniel had ever thrown at her. They hadn't just taken her bed. They had forged her trust, her name. Robert's hand brushed her shoulder gently. "Helen, we'll fight this. You have grounds." But she straightened, her eyes hardening. "No, Robert. We'll do more than fight." She turned toward Emily and her lawyer, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Fine. Let's play by their rules." Then she walked toward the door, each step measured, her dignity intact. Behind her, the house buzzed with nervous whispers. They thought they had won, but the look in Helen's eyes said otherwise. The next afternoon, sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the Parker living room, casting long rectangles across the wooden floor. The house smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Helen stood near the table, holding the manila folder Clara had given her the day before. Her hands didn't shake now. The time for tears was over. Daniel sat on the couch, restless, his knee bouncing as if he was trying to outrun the silence. Emily hovered beside him, arms crossed, eyes wary. Agnes lingered by the staircase, pretending to scroll through her phone, though every muscle in her face betrayed her curiosity. Helen placed the folder on the coffee table and slid it toward her son. "Read this." Daniel frowned. "What is it?" Just read. He hesitated, then flipped the folder open. The first page was a printout of Emily's Facebook post. His eyes skimmed the words, confusion flickering across his face, then darkening into disbelief. Living with a controlling mother-in-law is exhausting. I swear, one day I'll find a way to have this house to ourselves. He blinked, reading it again, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes had seen. Then came the screenshots, iMessages between Emily and her friend Paige. She's stubborn, but Mom and I have a plan. Once she's out, she won't come back. Daniel's breathing changed, slower, sharper. The paper in his hands trembled. What is this, Emily? Emily stepped forward quickly. Daniel, it's nothing. Just me venting. You know how people post things when they're frustrated. It doesn't mean anything. Helen said nothing. She stood still, letting the truth echo in the quiet. Daniel kept reading, his jaw tightening with each message. You said you'd find a way to get her out. His voice rose. You told Paige you were done sharing your house with a woman who thinks she still matters here. Emily reached for his arm. Daniel, stop, please. I didn't mean it like that. He pulled away. Didn't mean it? You and your mother made me believe my own mom was impossible to live with. You made me choose between my mother and you. Agnes straightened, her tone icy. Watch your tone, young man. Emily has done everything for you. Daniel turned toward her, his eyes blazing. Everything? You've manipulated me, both of you. You knew exactly what you were doing. Agnes took a step back, clutching her phone like a shield. We were just trying to make a home for you. No, he said sharply. You were trying to take mine away from her. Emily's face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek. Daniel, please. You're overreacting. He slammed the folder shut. The sound cracked through the room like thunder. Enough. This ends now. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily's lip trembled. Agnes looked away, and Helen, still motionless, felt her heart ache, not from victory, but from the sight of her son breaking under the weight of truth. Daniel finally turned to her, voice hoarse. Mom, I'm so sorry. Helen met his eyes gently. You needed to see for yourself. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt charged, almost electric, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The lies had been dragged into the light, and there was no putting them back. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, the storm had already broken. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. The argument had drained everyone. Words hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. Daniel sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, hands pressed to his face. He looked nothing like the man who had shouted hours ago. The anger was gone. What remained was shame. Helen stood by the window, watching the breeze shift the curtains. Her reflection in the glass was steady, calm. But her heart ached for the boy sitting behind her, the boy who once promised, I'll never leave you, Mom. Daniel's voice finally broke the silence. Mom, his tone was hoarse, fragile. I threw you out of your own house. He looked up at her, eyes red and wet. I don't deserve forgiveness. Helen turned slowly, her expression soft but resolute. You were blind, not cruel, she said gently. Love can make people forget where loyalty belongs. He shook his head. No, Mom. I let them convince me you were the problem. I watched you pack your bags, and I did nothing. What kind of son does that? Helen walked over and sat beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The kind who made a mistake, she said, and the kind who still has time to fix it. Tears streamed down Daniel's cheeks as he covered his face. I was so stupid, he whispered. Helen pulled him into her arms, the way she used to when he was a child. A mother always forgives, she murmured. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means believing you can do better. Emily stood a few feet away, her face pale, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "So that's it," she snapped. "You just take her side now? After everything we've built?" Daniel looked up at her, his voice steady for the first time that day. "What we built was on lies." Emily flinched. "You're going to regret this." He stood, shoulders squared. "The only thing I regret is letting you turn me against my own mother." He took a deep breath, glancing at Agnes, who stood frozen near the doorway. "You and your mother are leaving. Today." Agnes's mouth fell open. "You can't be serious." "I am," Daniel interrupted. "You can both find another place. I'll go with you if I have to, but not under my mother's roof. Not anymore." Emily's anger cracked into disbelief. "Daniel, where will you even go?" "You can't afford." "I'll figure it out," he said. "We'll find a small apartment, start over. I'd rather live in one room than in a house built on deceit." The words settled heavy in the air. Helen rose slowly, her eyes filled with quiet pride. Daniel wasn't the lost boy anymore. He was the man she had hoped he would become. Flawed, humbled, but honest. He turned toward her again, his voice breaking. "I can't change what I did, Mom, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." Helen brushed a tear from his cheek, her voice trembling but warm. "Then start by standing tall, Daniel. The rest will follow." Outside, the late afternoon sun slipped behind the trees, painting the walls in gold. The house, once heavy with betrayal, felt lighter, emptier but freer. And for the first time since the storm began, Helen allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could rebuild what deceit had tried to destroy. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the driveway as the last of the boxes were loaded into the trunk. Emily stood beside the car, arms folded, her face hard and unreadable. Agnes hovered close by, muttering under her breath, her expression caught somewhere between defiance and disbelief. The tension that had once filled the house now clung to the air outside like the final echo of a storm. Helen stood on the front porch, silent, her hands resting on the railing. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Every moment of resistance, every cruel remark, every night she'd cried herself to sleep, none of it required explanation anymore. The truth had already spoken. Daniel helped close the car trunk, his movements careful, mechanical. Emily avoided his eyes. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, though her tone lacked conviction. Daniel met her gaze one last time. "I do. It's the only way we'll ever have a chance to start over." Agnes scoffed, sliding into the passenger seat. "You'll regret it." Daniel didn't respond. He stepped back as Emily got into the car and turned the ignition. For a moment, the engine stalled, then started with a reluctant roar. The car rolled slowly down the gravel driveway, tires crunching against the stones that Michael Parker himself had laid years ago. Helen watched without moving. When the car turned the corner and disappeared from view, the silence that followed was vast, almost sacred. She walked down the steps and onto the path, the scent of lavender drifting from the garden. Michael had planted those flowers for her on their 10th anniversary. They had survived every season, frost, drought, neglect, and somehow still bloomed, as if reminding her that endurance could be beautiful too. Helen sat down on the wooden chair by the porch, the same spot where she and Michael had shared tea at sunset every evening. The chair creaked beneath her, familiar and comforting. She closed her eyes, letting the late summer breeze brush against her face. The house behind her stood still, its windows reflecting the fading light. Once it had been filled with laughter, with arguments, with the sound of Daniel's footsteps running down the hallway. Later, it had been filled with tension, whispers, and lies. Now it was quiet again, but it was an honest kind of quiet, the kind that made space for healing. Her phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen. She answered immediately. "Mom." His voice was soft, uncertain. "I'm here," she said. I just wanted to say, I'll call you every day. Until things are right. I'll fix this, Mom. I promise. Helen smiled faintly. You don't need to fix it, Daniel. Just live better. That's enough. There was a pause on the line, then the sound of him exhaling, the weight of guilt easing just slightly. I love you, Mom. I know, she whispered. You finally learned. When the call ended, Helen set the phone beside her and looked out over the garden. The wind stirred again, carrying the faint rustle of the lavender and the distant hum of the town below. She rose slowly, her knees stiff but steady, and walked back toward the house. The front door creaked as she opened it. Inside, the air was still and faintly dusty, but warm sunlight spilled across the floor, touching the furniture like an old friend returning home. Helen moved to the living room and pushed open the wide window facing the west. The golden light flooded in, chasing away the shadows that had lingered for too long. The house felt empty, but for the first time in years, it also felt hers again.